Welcome to Deadline, a discussion and critique by some of Washington's most seasoned journalists and pundits on how the media has covered the week's news events without the shouting heard on those other news programs. I'm your host, Wayne Madsen. Joining me on the panel this week are Helena Cobban from Just World Books, Alyson Chadwick, writer and strategic communications consultant, and Carey Campbell, writer and blogger. Welcome, everybody, to Deadline. The media has been criticized for playing up certain GOP candidates and downplaying candidates like Ron Paul and the last dropout, Jon Huntsman. Let's talk about media bias in the campaign and what it portends for the future of the 2012 campaign. We've also seen Mitt Romney referred to as a venture capitalist with the phrase vulture capitalist, a virtual no-no. So let me go to you first, Helena. It's 2012. We've all been either expecting or dreading this election campaign. Where do you see do you think that the charges that the media is showing favoritism, do you think they carry weight, these charges?
Well, there's a few things going on here, Wayne. One is that obviously, you know, the Republicans have this huge sort of media circus known as the primary campaign, which the Democrats don't have. So for starters, they're getting a whole lot more coverage. And you have to admit that as a circus goes, this one is pretty amusing. I mean, there are all kinds of flubs and mistakes, and people are up and people are down. It has its own kind of quirky drama, which even keeps people like my husband engaged. I try not to watch the campaigns, quite frankly, because there's so much idiocy there. But so that's one thing that's going on. The Republicans have center stage for this period. And then the other is that, you know, when you talk about media coverage, well, there's paid media and there's unpaid media. And there's a huge amount of paid media. That is advertisements on TV stations, which are kind of addictive for the stations. I mean, a lot of small media outlets in this country literally couldn't make it without that infusion of advertising cash once every 2 years. Right. So, you know, they love it, obviously, and a lot of that paid media has been extremely divisive and harsh, and the people who have the big money, like Newt Gingrich and Mitt Romney, you know, who have extremely rich friends who just this year, more than ever, have been piling money into these new vehicles called super PACs, which are completely unregulated. Right. That's been a big part of it. And the unpaid media, you know, the working journalists or whatever, yes, they tend to marginalize Ron Paul and sometimes to laugh at Jon Huntsman. You know, there's this assumption, a sort of lowest common denominator assumption, that the American people are provincial-minded and closed-minded and xenophobic. So there's a kind of, let's laugh at Jon Huntsman because he happens to speak fluent Chinese. Well, I would say speaking fluent Chinese in the 21st century is going to be a huge advantage.
And Mitt Romney speaks French from his Mormon missionary days, and he was, of course, attacked by Newt Gingrich for that. Alyson,
and by the way, Newt Gingrich also speaks French. So
oh, okay.
He got his
PhD
PhD in Belgium.
That's good to know. So
it's
we
sort
see
of
hypocrisy in plain view. Helena was talking about maybe too much exposure. How many debates have there been so far? 19 or maybe 20 now? And you get, you get these candidates. For example, Rick Perry making this comment that Turkey is governed by a bunch of Islamic terrorists.
And now we have the State Department having to kind of clean up after that.
And I mean, is this a situation where Barack Obama could just look like he's the most sane and knowledgeable person in the running when you hear somebody like Perry make a comment like that? And I mean, you can imagine that, the Turkey's quite upset, but there have been other issues having to do with the Middle East about one of the candidates, I believe, said there's no such thing as a Palestinian state. There never has. Gingrich said that. Is this a case where the Republicans are just being hoisted on their own petard because so much exposure and so little intellect?
There's been a lot of exposure, and there's been a little sort of a dearth in perhaps substance. But I personally think it's a good and a bad thing. I mean, I personally enjoyed watching Jon Huntsman because I liked seeing a candidate that was thoughtful and was not setting his hair on fire and saying things like, oh, well, Barack Obama is Hitler and he was born in Kenya. And I thought as a liberal Democrat that having him be the nominee would elevate the discourse to a level where it should be on things like China and our relationship with the world. And so I was disappointed to see his campaign sort of implode. I read, where did it go wrong? I don't think it ever really went right from the get-go.
Right.
Because he tried to put himself as a sane one, and the Republicans don't really want the sane one. They want the maybe the Rick Perry or the Herman Cain or the Michelle Bachmann, or now Newt Gingrich is having, I think, he's a three-peat almost. You know, he was good, and then he collapsed, and then he collapsed a second time, and then he
right.
now he seems to be rising in South Carolina. So,
Yeah.
but I personally, there's been 17 debates. I think the 17th one is on Thursday, and I think it's good to show this much of the process to the people of America. Because people don't pay. I mean, I pay uber attention. I'm obsessed with it.
Right.
But most people are not.
Right.
And I think it's good to have all this attention on it.
Carey, do you think there's a point here that the Fox News is, and not just Fox, CNN certainly co-hosted a debate with the Tea Party. There was a lot of criticism of that, but that these 24/7 news networks have been overemphasizing the Michelle Bachmanns, the Herman Cains, the other people out there on the fringes, where the Huntsmans and the Ron Paul, who certainly has been called unelectable, a fringe candidate, but there's also some people we never heard of, former governor of New Mexico, Gary Johnson, and Buddy Roemer, the former governor of Louisiana, running for the GOP, no attention paid at all. So do you think there's some point to this flagrant and blatant media bias?
Well, I come at this with my own strong Green Party bias, and of course, having had 3 decades of experience in this, the phrase that came to mind as I listened to all of you was, our system in the United States is pay to play. And you made the point of that money, that advertising money that small media concerns get, they live on it. And I think that, you know, the Green Party in the United States has been actively as a unified national party about 10 years now, and growing. And you see that where you can buy advertising, where a candidate can run, a Green Party candidate can run and buy advertising, which we saw in Virginia in a local race with Dr. Audrey Clement. Then she got coverage. She got regular coverage. So it's pay to play in that regard. And in the presidential race we see right now, we see excellent Green Party candidates out there running for the Green Party nomination. Dr. Jill Stein, who is a Harvard Medical School graduate, has run twice, been elected and re-elected to local office, has run for governor 3 times. She ran in the race with Romney in 2002. Most people who watched the debate said that she won the debate, yet much of American media is just, it's a blackout. It's almost like the 1950s when you had films and writers who were blacked out. And you see that with Green Party candidates. The state Green Party, and you see it on every level. You see it at the local level, you see it at the state legislative races. And you mentioned the money that is infused every couple of years. My experience is that in Virginia, anyway, that money flows every year. We just had state elections last year, and we have in the state legislature in Virginia 40 members of the state Senate. Now, those state Senate races, some of them spend more than the congressional races, $3 million in a single race. And we have House of Delegates, we have 100 members of that in Virginia, and we have races there where they spend a couple of $1 million. Right. So the question was of the coverage of the presidential cycle, and is it biased, is it overblown? It's not wide enough. But of course, as a blogger myself and with a YouTube channel, you know, we have, it has changed. We've got that worldwide access now. And when you have, just as we did this week, you have a massive demonstration of Occupy, people out here, suddenly the big boys are starting to pay a little more attention.
Right, right. Well, we asked some people on the street although K Street, which may not be representative of the country as a whole, but we asked folks out on the street what they thought about this year's presidential race, and here's what they had to say.
What I've seen from the GOP candidates, I would be shocked if Romney was not the candidate, which I think is a terrible thing. He is financed by the same people who financed Barack Obama, so we will have a choice of no choice. Do we want, Goldman Sachs or Goldman Sachs? So that's what I see. I see basically, it doesn't matter if Romney or Obama gets in there, the same policies will continue. We're heading towards disaster no matter what, I believe.
I don't think any of President Obama's opponents really have a solid lead. I know Mitt Romney's, doing well in the primaries, but I don't really think he has the capacity to really beat President Obama, especially some of the great reforms that he's done during his term in office, like getting health reform passed, which has a lot of tangible benefits to a lot of Americans. So I think, the economy is still doing poorly, but I think President Obama will likely take the upcoming election again.
I think it's good news for Obama that things have been as crazy as they have on the Republicans' end, but I think it's going to end up shaking out as still being a pretty interesting final election.
That was an interesting point one of the people on the street had to say about Goldman Sachs versus Goldman Sachs. When you look at, of course, Romney, Bain Capital, which it never has come up before. Now, thanks to some of that big money that Gingrich had, he apparently bought a documentary and he was showing it, and I've seen it. It's very hard-hitting about how Bain Capital, this company that Romney ran, basically went into these towns and the factories were closed, the people lost their jobs, the plant equipment was sent abroad, and of course there's some issue whether this was funded, as they said in the documentary, by shady characters from South America. I think that may have been saying that maybe some drug dealers were financing the production, or the Bain Capital operation. But when it comes to real choice, because the media is controlled by these corporations, do you think they can actually see what the deal is? I mean, we have Obama and his ties to Goldman Sachs, and we have Romney and his ties to not only Goldman Sachs, but Bain Capital and all these other Wall Street operations. Do you think that the corporate media can even fairly cover this race if it is, in fact, between Romney and Obama?
There are some voices in the corporate media that I would trust on economic issues. Like Paul Krugman, for example, who I think has really taken on a lot of the shibboleths and of the kind of market fundamentalist viewpoint that we had in this country, that we still have in this country, and who's arguing that we need a much more Keynesian policy in order to recover from the Great Recession, not to mention possible depression that we're still in, really. But the corporate media, obviously, they're all interlocking ownership amongst the big media companies in this country, CBS, NBC, Fox News, and the venture capitalists and Sony Entertainment. And, it is all a huge thing. But as Carey mentioned earlier, now they don't have the monopoly that they used to have in the 1990s. I've been blogging at Just World News since 2003, and it was remarkable what we could achieve in those early years of blogging. Now the blogosphere has settled down somewhat now, and every single major news outlet has its army of bloggers and whatever, but still you don't have that total information blackout that we used to have. And that has to be a force for liberation of people's thought. But having said that, it's still really hard to get your message out in terms of the real anger that there is in this country about the high degree of inequality and power between the rich and the poor. It was interesting that the Tea Party, in a sense, were the ones who first started mobilizing on the street around this issue, although they were doing so from a very right-wing point of view. I'm just really delighted that we now have the counterpoint from the Occupy movement, which is bringing a real progressive voice and pushing, let's hope, pushing the Democratic Party somewhat or considerably, so that it, let's hope, maybe, doesn't continue to be just the party of Goldman Sachs.
Right. Alyson, you're down on Capitol Hill. We can talk about Romney and Obama till the cows come home, but the polling of Congress is much
abysmal.
lower.
Yeah,
I mean, I think it's the lowest it's been
ever. I think
probably ever.
13%, I think 14% of people approve of Congress's job that they're doing. So
we have to remember that we've got, a third of the Senate up for re-election this year. We've got all the House. We've had some long-serving members decide they're not going to run again, especially in the House. People like Barney Frank and Jerry Lewis and others have been around for a long time. Do you think that we always anticipate, is this the year we're going to, the anti-incumbent year, but it turns out sometimes people, instead of throwing the bums out, they keep their own bum in their own congressional district because of the pork barrel stuff that's coming in.
Well, it's not just that. I think people do tend to not like Congress as sort of the institution, but they like their own member of Congress. Mm-hmm. And I've worked on both sides of the Hill. I worked for Senator Feinstein, and I worked for Congressman Joe Sestak. And there's a lot of constituent services that get done. It's not just pork. It's, Senator D'Amato from New York was Senator Pothole. I mean, people like to have a tie to Congress. But I don't think it's going to be as severe as we're making it out to be now. I mean, everyone says, Congress is so unpopular. But I also think, some of the stuff about the Romney situation you were talking about a minute ago was kind of unfair on Romney. I can't believe I'm probably the most conservative person in this room right now, which is an odd place for me to be. But Bob Shrum actually brought a lot of the things up. He's a Democratic consultant, and when he worked for Ted Kennedy, who Romney ran for that Senate seat, a lot of this stuff came up back then. And I almost think it's unfair what Newt Gingrich is doing.
I mean, certainly
Romney.
the kind of the intimations of South American drug lords really kind of that crosses a line into ethnic stereotyping.
Well, and also I think we've had so much conversation about Kenya and birth certificates, and I just find that all to be a little bit distasteful. And I don't agree with the idea that both Romney and Obama are both going to be the president from Goldman Sachs. I think we say that all the time, like, they're all the same. And if you look at the policies that the Obama administration has championed, and as a woman, I like that I like to have abortion be legal. I like it to be safe, legal, and rare, like the Clintons used to say. But I think there's a lot of difference between the two candidates, or the two.
Would kind of help if he didn't keep hiring these people from Goldman Sachs. And, I mean, if he hired people from elsewhere, it would look better, I think.
It would look better, but I don't know if it would be any better. I mean, I think we do need people who know a little bit about the system. But
it's not only big bankers who know something about the system. I mean, I think that is a fallacy.
If he was only hiring people from Goldman Sachs, but they're not the only people working in his administration. So it's not like you have to, everyone, you go from Goldman Sachs or Bain Capital, and now you're suddenly, everyone is from the White House.
Before we start talking about the media in general and divorce it from the political campaign, I recall, and I'm old enough to recall what happened with Romney's father, Governor George Romney, in 1967. And we've heard these Republican candidates, except for Ron Paul, talk about who's going to be the first to bomb this country and that country. But we had George Romney, governor of Michigan, who went to Vietnam. He had been supporting the war effort, but he went to Vietnam, and he came back, and he made one comment. He said, I was brainwashed. Now, this was the year 67 that The Manchurian Candidate was finally released, the movie about a mind-controlled assassin. But everybody thought he was talking about that he had been brainwashed, like in some Pavlov Institute. But what he was talking about was the generals and the people in charge of the war had brainwashed them, that Vietnam was not going swimmingly, as was suggested. And eventually that cost George Romney the Republican nomination. So do you think there may be some parallels here where candidates, I'm not just talking about Mitt Romney, but any candidate says something and it's just totally taken out of context? Because certainly Mitt Romney must remember his dad coming home very frustrated from those news conferences where he was trying to say, that's not what I said. it was the Vietnam War that he was brainwashed on.
Well, I think Green Party candidates like Dr. Jill Stein or Dr. Kent Mesplay would be fortunate in the mainstream American media to be taken in any context. Any press is good press. I do want to agree with what Alyson said, though. Being somebody who's out there every day on the street and out there doing politics, while there's a whole lot of whining and complaining, and the opinion polls show disapproval ratings for the U.S. Congress, the numbers of people actually running for office, whether it's local, state, or federal, continue to be abysmal. Half of all elections in the United States are unopposed. That means only the incumbents on the ballot. And cream does rise to the top. You see that. I'm a member of my PTA, Civic Association, and various local things. And that's where most real politicians that rise to the federal level come from. And so they understand constituent service. Mm-hmm. So I don't see, like Alyson, I don't see a major change. Right. And in direct answer, Wayne, to your question, I think Ron Paul is, you alluded to it in your open, is oftentimes taken out of context. I am a Green Party conservative, by the way. So I'm normally the most conservative person in the room. And Ron Paul, a lot of people don't know this, but Ron Paul, the Independent Green Party in Virginia, put Ron Paul on their ballot line 4 years ago as their vice presidential nominee. Mm-hmm. He ultimately withdrew, but and I think his part of pulling the American military home, that very important point where we're spending one of every 3 federal tax dollars, that is often misrepresented in the mainstream media, distorted, ignored. One of the shows, I believe it was just last night on MSNBC, Rachel Maddow, because she had not shown Ron Paul the night before on the story she did, she ignored him, clever PhD that she is, she made it up by putting his head on the screen through the entire program to apologize. So right. The metaphor or the example you gave of the Manchurian Candidate, I suppose some of the war profiteers in what I like to call George Bush's oil party, I suppose that some of those folks might think that all of their, warmongering profits, to put it in a kind way, they feel that threatened, and I'm sure that they very much are worried about that, and they don't want to see that happen. And at the same time, it's one of the reasons I admire Ron Paul's courage even more to stand in this last debate, as the media reported, Juan Williams from Fox was heckled. And Ron Paul's quite a bit. And Ron Paul has experienced that, not only in this cycle, but in previous cycles. Right. And he stands his ground in a gentlemanly fashion. Right.
Well, I do want to make one point about Ron Paul and about the media coverage of him, which is that he says things that to me make some sense every now and again. But then when he departs the reservation, he needs to take a plane to get back. He goes so far off, and it's right. Like FEMA's going to come in and take your guns from you when you have a crisis, or some of the comments he's made about gays have just been out of control, crazy. Right. It's just like AIDS is spread by sweat. Just what are you talking about?
He didn't say that. Surely he didn't say that.
Look it up.
You're referring to those letters or those things that he has denied that he didn't write. Okay.
Well, I didn't write them. They had my name on them, and I sent my office in
notwithstanding all of that, his voice as a clearly anti-war voice in the Republican Party has been unique. And, there used to be such a thing as a liberal wing or, a kind of small c conservative wing of the Republican Party that was very wary about overseas entanglements.
Well, Governor George Romney was placed in that wing back in 1967.
And Nelson Rockefeller and right. all kinds of people. That wing doesn't exist anymore, Lowell Weicker, all those, liberal Republicans. So you have the only anti-war voice in the party now is coming from something kind of close to the Tea Party. I mean, there are Tea Party people who are outrageous jingoists and want us to bomb every country on God's earth. And there are people in the Tea Party who say no and follow Ron Paul in saying we've got to come back home.
While we're on the media bias and media coverage, we asked some folks on the street what they thought about the media in general, and here's what they had to say.
One of the things is the hunger that's going on all over the world, in Somalia, over in Africa, and India, different places. People are having problems achieving some kind of goal in life, and it's just a tough situation, And
it's just not getting much coverage.
Right. Yeah, it's not getting the coverage that it should be.
I'm really proud of the 99%ers, those people that are camping out there in this very cold weather, dealing with very adverse conditions, so that they can bring to attention the growing disparity of the uber-rich in this country and the working people. I think those people are to be commended. I think the National Park Service is to be commended for resisting pressure from the Republicans in Congress to take away their free speech rights. This is what this country is built on. This is what the revolution was like, the American Revolution was like all those years ago. This is closer to the actual Tea partiers in Boston than the people who call themselves the Tea Party now.
The National Defense Authorization Act, which calls for indefinite detention of American citizens without trial or representation, has gotten no media coverage, and it is the most disastrous piece of legislation that has been passed in my lifetime. Patriot Act was terrible. This is, just as bad as the Patriot Act. It strips us of our rights. We're here protesting. We can be locked up indefinitely for being, dissenters under this act, and nobody talks about it. You see it sometimes, and independent media talks about it, but the mainstream media just falls in line and doesn't report on it. Objectivity is another thing. Objectivity is gone in the media. They answer to their corporate sponsors. It's about ratings. It's not about informing the public. A democracy relies on an honest media, so we know what's going on, so we can make informed decisions, and that's gone. That's gone. It's all corporate and money now, and that's all that matters.
Well, there were some criticisms. We've heard them all before of the media. And, there were some criticisms that the media should be covering certain stories, but they're not. Whether one person was talking about famine and hunger in Africa and the indefinite detention provisions in the Defense Authorization Act. And yes, you can go to many blogs and YouTube offerings, and people will talk about these issues. But I think just go around the panel here, and is there a sense that those people who have access, those journalists who have access in this town, whether it's the White House, Congress, State Department, are serving really as stenographers for the press releases, and they're not asking the questions anymore? My friend Helen Thomas, I think, was probably the last person in the White House who actually would ask an untoward question, but they used to happen all the time with Sam Donaldson and others who covered, especially the Nixon administration. What do you think about these charges that there are important stories that are just not being covered because there's no interest by the White House, the Congress, State Department, and most of all, the bureau chiefs and the editors?
Well, Wayne, I grew up in England, and the press plays a very different role there and in Europe in general. I think when I came to this country in the early 80s, I was surprised to see the degree to which the press kind of thinks of itself as the fourth branch of government. And I think part of the reason for this is that members of Congress come and go. Presidents come and go. They only stay for 8 years maximum. And each of those actors brings in a whole raft of people from their own home state, from Atlanta, Georgia, or wherever, who are not familiar with the ways of Washington. The people who stay in Washington, the national institutions, if you like, are those big media figures who become sort of, your Tom Friedman, your institutional memory, like,
The earth is flat. Yeah.
Yeah.
The fourth estate.
Fourth estate, yeah.
And whereas in European countries, you have a much more stable kind of political class, and maybe that's good, maybe that's bad, but you have, somebody like a Sarkozy or a Margaret Thatcher or, David Cameron. They don't rise to become a national leader till they've spent time in the parliament. They know the issues, they're familiar with the institutional history. The press plays a very different role and is not the repository of the institutional history. So that's one thing. Somebody coming like Jimmy Carter comes from Georgia, or Barack Obama comes from Chicago to Washington. They're very reliant on the media to kind of frame the issues and explain the issues. And that makes for a kind of a deference that, of course, it's very hard for a mortal to withstand. And, if people start treating you like Tom Friedman, you will soon end up behaving like Tom Friedman. God forbid.
Tom's a nice guy.
He's a nice guy, but, I knew him back in Beirut when he was a proper journalist. I actually taught him how to get around Beirut as a journalist. He was very wet behind the ears in those days. He would get out his notebook and he would run around and he would actually expend the shoe leather and do the reporting. Now, he sits there and people come to him, and he's a poobah. He's he gets paid huge amounts of money and is. I mean, it's a very different role than what you have.
And he's certainly not the only one. We could
name
many others here.
I'm not.
David Gregory, who hosts Meet the Press.
So it's just a different role that the media plays,
right.
And so you get far less of that questioning. There are a few people like Matt Lee of AP in the State Department briefings. He's relentless, asking the questions. But by and large, people don't do that because they are reliant on access. Mm-hmm. As you mentioned, so it's a kind of a cozy, and then all this business about White House Correspondents' Dinner and it strikes me as ways too insidery.
Inside baseball.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, Helena, there's some great reporters still out there. Of course, all those here. Bob Lewis, Associated Press in Richmond, Virginia. Very fair reporter. He even covers the Green Party.
McClatchy has a great bureau here in D.C., but that's small. That's not.
And I disagree that it's. I mean, I think Chuck Todd asked some really good questions, but I think the problem with the media really isn't at the national level. It's that because I personally think that the news part of an organization shouldn't have to make the same kind of money that the entertainment. I'm thinking of ABC right now.
Right.
But then you look at how state governments are being covered. That's really where the problems are.
Yeah. Yes.
Because
and also, like these public utility commissions, they have no one covering these anymore. So some people suggest that's the bloggers are now showing up at these commissions and these blue ribbon panels that make very important decisions.
And the SEC and the FCC and
the regulatory commissions as well.
There are papers in California that outsource their government coverage to India.
Yeah.
It's kind of. I'm serious.
Right. No, yes,
I'm not kidding.
absolutely.
I couldn't make that up if I wanted to. I'm very creative, but I'm not that creative.
That's happening more and more.
It's embarrassing that we have such. When I worked on state campaigns, and you go to a small town, and the crime reporter is now doing both the camera operating and the interviewing of the candidates, and they don't know even what they're running for half the time, and it's kind of an embarrassment.
Let me mention some positives. Current. Al Gore, former Vice President Al Gore's new network, Current, with Keith Olbermann and David Schuster and the Young Turks. They're doing great work over there. Yeah. They're doing great work over there. And the former governor of Michigan.
But you got to be fired, it seems, from MSNBC to get a job over there.
That is a requirement.
On a local level, if you're not aware of this, Patch.com is out there doing the old. When I started out as a teenage reporter, the stuff you go down, you get the obituaries, and Patch.com is doing that same local stuff. We've got them in our local cycle, and they have been the notable exception about covering Green Party candidates in local and state races, and doing meet profiles. And it's a fascinating concept there. What they're doing. You can go in and post all the propaganda you want as a video, pictures, so that it integrates. And I believe it's an outgrowth of Arianna Huffington and AOL.
I don't trust Arianna Huffington as far as I could.
But she has red hair.
I don't care what color her hair is. I worked for Dianne Feinstein during the race that she ran against Michael Huffington, and I will never trust Arianna Huffington from that
Well,
point
she
forward.
certainly has tried both wings, the conservative
Today,
Republicans.
who knows what she is today? Who knows
Exactly.
who's going to be tomorrow?
HuffPo has opened up some space. I mean,
Oh, right. It's a personal problem I have. But.
Can I just, and since I wanted to praise the people in the media, I did want to remark about the comments from the street were just lucid, intelligent, precise, and I wanted to echo what the one lady said in praising the Park Service and how they have handled Occupy. I was out with the Occupy Congress yesterday, and the Green Party candidates, Dr. Jill Stein and David Cobb, and the police were fabulous. They had a lieutenant running the police out there with these hundreds and hundreds of demonstrators, and he was almost a stand-up comic. He was fabulous. You know, he was directing the police, and also, some of these folks are young and they're upset and they're angry, and he would leaven things with a joke.
This city has been very supportive of the Occupy protesters
the city administration has always been kind of liberal democratic. Let's face it,
What's that Green Party influence in this?
While we're talking about people on the street, let's move to people on the street who are unemployed. And moving on to the economic crisis, several other European Union nations have now joined Greece in the poor credit category, including France. Can the media, particularly the business media like CNBC and Fox Business News, be trusted not to hype the ratings gains from Moody's and Standard & Poor? And let's wrap that into what's going on here in the United States. There's a perception that there's just this economic meltdown. We see it in Europe with a half dozen more European countries being downgraded. Greece may default. The United States certainly has had this issue with its credit rating before, and we're talking unemployment numbers. They seem to be static. How do you think the media, is the media adequately covering? Because that Gingrich documentary, I think, we can question some of the facts, but it was almost like a Michael Moore documentary where they went into these towns, these blighted communities, and these people, no health care left, no work, two people working for the same shut down factory. Do you think that the economy, remember what James Carville said, running for president, he was advising Clinton, it's the economy stupid. Are we back to that? But can we trust these, like Kramer, this guy Kramer on CNBC, who's basically running a pump and dump operation, I think in violation of the SEC. Can these business channels, and then they put their people on the regular news channels to make commentary, can they be trusted to cover this economic situation?
No, I think, what we saw in the 2000s, the degree to which there was no systematic or critical coverage of the housing price bubble in the mainstream media. Even though, the blogs that I was reading, there's a great blog called Calculated Risk that was looking at this very closely. Paul Krugman was looking at it on his blog. But the mainstream media was oblivious to it and just allowed, that bubble to get bigger and bigger and bigger, which meant when it popped, it was worse than it need have been if there had been adequate coverage from the media and from the regulatory agencies. Right. In economics, there's this thing called regulatory capture, which is when basically the heavy hitters in an industry in various ways capture mentally capture the people who should be regulating them. So the people who should be regulating them get to think like them. And I think that's happened in journalism to a large extent. People move from being, a stock trader with, let's just throw out the name Goldman Sachs, to being, the finance editor for CNBC seamlessly.
Or a nighttime host on CNN. We won't mention any names, but the initials are Aaron Burnett. But
and what you don't get is people with experience in manufacturing. Manufacturing used to be the absolute hub of this country's wealth, and it needs to be an important part of the country's wealth going forward. You can't have a good economy without a strong manufacturing center. You don't have anybody who has experience or understanding of that who are, recognized commentators or writers in the national media. You don't have labor economists. The many people who work with the labor unions or understand labor issues, understand the needs and desires of working people in this country. They don't get the plum jobs on, CNN and ABC and CNBC. Right. So the whole kind of the debate is framed by what is the New York Stock Exchange doing today? And they tell you, the economy's up or the economy's down based on the stock exchange numbers, not based on employment and people's real concerns.
Again, do you think we're talking about inside baseball when we're talking about reporting on the economy?
I think it's a little bit of inside baseball, but it's important because the media right now covers these things from such a superficial point of view, sort of the Twitter, and I love Twitter, but it's all 140 characters or less, 40 seconds, and you got to get the whole story. And it is so important, and I don't think the media is doing a very good job at all of covering the economy and the root of the problem that we're having right now. Mm-hmm. And they won't, I don't think.
Yeah.
Not if we have to rely on Jim Cramer to do it. We're not going to get anything from him.
Well, I can remember in the past you had people who were dedicated to covering Wall Street, but independently. Mm-hmm. They didn't look good on television necessarily. They were reporters. The bow tie wearing Irving R. Levine. He was always there from NBC. But if you wanted to know what was happening on Wall Street, he's telling you that. Now, of course, he's not the somebody that worked on one of the Goldman Sachs or Lehman Brothers or something, because he was independent. I'm not, there were others like him. And you think that's been lost now, where we just don't have, not just the economy, but these TV journalists in general, they largely did not come out of the print or, in some cases, radio to television. They're just picked up because they're a pretty face.
Wayne, I know it's a shocking thing to say, but I don't know. I see good reporting all around locally. Our conversation has largely talked about TV, and I think that we see the shift to the visual, and I certainly see it on my blog versus our YouTube channel. We have a lot more interest in the YouTube channel than we do the blog, so maybe that shift has certainly occurred, and it's a new time. But I think that's part of the Republic. That's part of the democratic institutions of the Republic. We all realize that Kramer fella is amusing, entertaining. I don't take him seriously for a moment. And they have all of these networks that are constantly. It's a horse race like the presidential. It's demeaned, devalued. So if you're thoughtful, considerate, careful citizen, you go elsewhere to get your information. I had the benefit of being very active in the community, and I ran for office in the year of the collapse in 2008. We knocked on 40,000 doors, 40,000 households in my little district where I ran for local office. We knocked on 40,000 doors. So we had the benefit of seeing the devastating impact of all of these people who got these bad loans and lost their homes, and then they were upset. They didn't understand what had occurred, and many of them would tear up their house when they left. So I think that how that has to do with reporting, then I wrote about that. So you feet on the street, the old beat reporter. It's hard to beat.
Let's go overseas now, because we should really talk about what's happening in the Middle East. We've had this what's called the Arab Awakening with the demonstrations. Now we see Syria, basically almost a civil war, but it doesn't seem like there's the interest to get in there militarily like there was in Libya. We also have the Egyptian elections, which has put a majority in the incoming parliament, Muslim Brotherhood, but a sizable number of more extreme Salafists, which are to the right, actually, of the Muslim Brotherhood. Yeah. Do you think that the result of allowing or promoting the democratic transition in the Arab Middle East is having this blowback effect that the U.S., of course, has to abide by it, but we didn't certainly do it when Hamas won the elections in Palestine. Do you think that this is going to have a blowback? And we already heard Rick Perry, who may be out of this running for president, but he suggested that Turkey's government is run by Islamic terrorists. I mean, is this going to provide fodder for those who want to get more militarily involved in the Middle East? Because we've heard Perry and Gingrich and others say, well, we need to put our troops back in Iraq, and now we have the Syria situation in Turkey and whatnot.
God, I hope not. God, I hope not. I mean, haven't we had enough of that nonsense? I certainly have as an American taxpayer. And I think that the Green Party candidates that are out there and Ron Paul are right on the money, exactly what any sensible taxpayer needs to do. You know, King Abdullah of Jordan is at the White House with the president right now as we're sitting here. So you know they're talking about Syria and what's going to happen there. I'm in close touch with some Green Party people in Egypt that were involved in the election here, so I'm optimistic about that, although I was disappointed to see Joschka Fischer's old buddy El Baradei, who dropped out of the presidential race yesterday in Egypt. I think that's a loss. He was a real leader there.
But there are elements of the Republican Party or other parties that are going to find a way to get us into other military entanglements regardless of what's actually going on. I mean, I heard Newt Gingrich say that President Obama's policy on Iran is the weakest we've ever been in our history. And it's just, you've got to wonder.
When in fact we may be in some engagement now, which, you know, can only, you know, hope springs, you know, eternal, if there in fact is negotiations going on.
I want to get back to what you were saying about, you know, has the U.S. kind of stirred up this democratic wave in the Middle East and it's now backfiring? I don't think that's what happened at all, honestly. And, you know, I was in Egypt in June, I was in Palestine, I was in Algeria in October. I've traveled in all these countries a lot, and all the participants in these movements are adamant, apart from in Libya, that it's their movement, and it's nothing to do with, as some people in this country like to say, you know, it's the example of our democratic opening in Iraq. In fact, Iraq, what happened in Iraq under the U.S. military occupation for every single other Arab has been an object lesson in what to avoid because of the terrible tragedies and internal social breakdown that was stirred up by the United States occupation forces there, setting Shiite against Sunni, against Christian, against Kurd, in a way that Saddam Hussein had tried, but he never did it as successfully as what the U.S. occupation did. So the fact that you had this fantastic democratic awakening, both in Tunis and in Egypt, was totally indigenous to those two countries. And if it was fomented by anything, it was fomented by a very sturdy democratic opposition to those two rulers who were U.S.-supported rulers in those countries. It was an anti-American, as much as it had a kind of anything to do with America. It was not supported or stirred up by America. So, you know, what we're seeing in those two countries is very, very hopeful. It's a real move toward getting governments there that will be more accountable to the real desires of those people. Now, it's further ahead in Tunis than what it is in Egypt, because in Egypt you still have the U.S. financed military is trying to keep their hand on the democratic process and prevent it. But I have great faith in my friends in Egypt that they're going to be able to deal with this. The very, very concerning thing is what's happening in Syria, where there is, you know, a genuine opposition to the repression of the Assad regime, but there are also hostile external hands stirring that up, including very, very right-wing Sunni Muslim powers and networks from Saudi Arabia, from some of those disenfranchised Sunnis in Iraq, and from Qatar. Qatar has shifted on a dime, you know, from being a big supporter of Arab causes and democracy in general to being very sectarian in support of Sunnis. So what you have in Syria is a standoff. You have a resilient government with a lot of support, and you have a resilient opposition with a lot of support.
Right. You brought up Qatar, and there's many people that believe that Al Jazeera, which during the U.S. invasion occupation of Iraq served as a good independent news media source, but now Al Jazeera seems to be basically embedding their journalists with various rebel groups. They did so in Libya. They've been accused of this in Syria and some other countries. Do you think that what was looked at as a voice of independence in the Middle East, number one, Al Jazeera, but there's a couple other networks, Al Arabiya, which is financed by the Saudis. Do you think that that they've lost their way, these independent?
You know, Al Jazeera has always been majorly funded by the government of Qatar,
right.
and the Emir of Qatar was installed by the Americans back in the 1990s. He's had his kind of disagreements with the Americans in particular over the invasion of Iraq. But for a long time, Al Jazeera was a beacon of really good journalism. Now, I think Al Jazeera Arabic has become just a tool of the Emir and his foreign policy. Al Jazeera English has retained a lot more independence, and that's kind of interesting.
Right.
You know, you pay the piper, you call the tune. I mean, it's the same everywhere.
Okay. Well, we asked some folks on the street what they thought about. Oh, we have a report, I should say. We have a report on what's going on in the Middle East, and let's go to that now.
In recent headlines, violence continues to surge in Syria. UN Security Council members remain divided on how to stop the bloodshed from the 10-month uprising against President Bashar al-Assad. U.S. President Barack Obama has vowed to redouble international efforts to force the Syrian leader to step down. Tensions between Iran and Western powers continue to escalate as the United States threatens Iran with embargoes on Iranian crude exports. Iran has responded, threatening to close the Hormuz Strait, a vital causeway for oil trade. Meanwhile, media agencies in the U.S. report on signs that military engagement with Iran could soon be imminent. The European Union plans to implement a ban on Iranian oil starting July 1st, a move that could be economically costly for the debt-struck countries of the European Union, who continue to reel from the 9 credit downgrades by international creditors Standard & Poor. With the U.S. presidential elections less than a year away, presidential frontrunners have hit the primary election season in full gear. One U.S. presidential candidate, Rick Perry, recently drew international media attention upon his questioning of Turkey's NATO membership and accusation that the country is ruled by Islamic terrorists. In the U.S., the Occupy Wall Street movement has started the year off with a new strategy, following a large demonstration dubbed Occupy Congress, which drew out hundreds of protesters to Capitol Hill and was also aimed at once again building momentum for the so-called 99%.
Well, the report on what's going on in the Middle East, certainly there has been this brinkmanship. It's been reported about West and Iran, but now the latest information out of there was a planned U.S.-Israeli military exercise, which has been postponed. Some people say canceled. Now the Israelis say it was their idea, but now we're hearing more and more that it was the Pentagon's idea. We do know that the U.S. Navy, the Fifth Fleet, often is in communication with the Iranian Navy to avoid incidents in the Gulf, but this Strait of Hormuz situation, do you think that was something that nobody wanted to go touch the Strait of Hormuz issue because it was like that line in the water, not in the sand?
Well, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff was there yesterday.
General Dempsey.
Wasn't he in secret meetings there yesterday?
There was secret meetings. Now there's a report of a maybe secret correspondence between President Obama and the Supreme Leader Khamenei in Iran. So do you think we've stepped very close, but maybe now wiser heads are prevailing, and even with these Republicans calling for a military attack, that people in this administration may be saying, wait a minute,
I'm sure that nobody in this administration, definitely not in the military or in Iran, wants there to be a war. But the situation is poised on a knife edge there, and there's a huge possibility of unintentional war. I'm actually tweeting sometimes these days with a hashtag late July 1914. Another situation where you had powers that didn't want to get into a war that got jerked into it. And in that respect, I'm a Quaker, I'm a pacifist. I oppose all wars because they never are the way to solve your problems at all.
You are correct.
But, thank you. But I would feel somewhat reassured if that military exercise in Israel had gone ahead, because as with Operation Desert Storm and Desert Shield in 1990, the presence of the U.S. military in Israel prevented the Israelis from doing all kinds of very risky things. So when the Israelis say that they actually canceled the exercise, they had reason to cancel it if they want to keep their options open for all kinds of inflammatory actions. I mean, we need urgent action internationally to de-escalate this thing.
We only have a short time left, but quickly around the panel, can President Obama afford any sort of new military confrontation in the middle of this election year, even with his Republican opponents, except for Paul, saying, we need to take such action? Let's start over here. A military confrontation, good for Obama or disastrous for Obama at this stage?
Oh, hell no. Just insane waste of tax dollars. The worst thing the United States could possibly do to get. It just always amazes me how you're going to spend $1,000 to fix a pothole or something out here, and we're worried about spending money, but the trillions can flow to military. That's crazy.
Alyson, help or hurt?
I think it would hurt tremendously, and I think he's so far been such a strong president in foreign relations, and I'm sure there's no one in the administration that wants to have any kind of military action. I worry, however, that when you have people like Newt Gingrich or Rick Perry make these comments, that people in other countries don't always understand that they're not really in a position of power to make these decisions or make these statements, and they might take it a little more seriously.
I'm sure we have to explain that to the Turkish government now that Rick Perry is governor of Texas. He's
never going to be president of anything.
Exactly.
So.
and finally, Helena, what do you think on the issue of war and peace?
I'm sure that it would be horrendously bad for Obama in his presidential bid if there were a military adventure. It would be bad for the country, obviously, as all of us have said here. But we have to remember there are people in the Republican Party who are almost taunting him to go to war. They're saying he goes around the world apologizing. They're calling him weak. They're calling him un-American. They are just needling and taunting him. And some of them, in particular, Newt Gingrich has, this very rich supporter, Sheldon Adelson, who's a big supporter of Netanyahu and the right wing in Israel. They could all push him into a situation that it would be hard for him to get out of. He needs to get out ahead of that kind of taunting and come forward with an actual serious diplomatic negotiated way out of this confrontation with Iran. And that could help him. But there are a lot of people in his administration who would be very nervous about that. We don't want to be seen to be, appeasing our enemies and all this demonization that's gone on. I think the American people would respond well to a very smart, diplomatic, negotiated kind of an initiative.
But the magic of politics, he's got Ron Paul in the Republican debate basically arguing against going to war and bringing the troops home. So do you think that's providing some cover for...
We have felt in this country that very directly the effects of the 9 years of war in Iraq, the 10 years of war in Afghanistan. We know what it's done. I mean, the ordinary American voter has a very vivid understanding of the costs.
It's 85%, isn't it? Isn't that the poll? And Jill Stein, the Green Party candidate, is also pushing Obama.
Okay, you got your plug in for your candidate, and that will do it for this week's Deadline. I want to thank our panel, and thank you for watching. Please join us again next week for another edition of Deadline.